Hello all, welcome to the show. I'm Gus Gagliardi and this is Fire Code Tech. On Fire Code Tech, we interview fire protection professionals from all different careers and backgrounds in order to provide insight and a resource for those in the field. My goal is to help you become a more informed fire protection professional. Fire Code Tech has interviews with engineers and researchers, fire marshals, and insurance professionals, and highlights topics like codes and standards, engineering systems, professional development, and trending topics in the industry. So if you're someone who wants to know more about fire protection or the fascinating stories of those who are in the field, you're in the right place. Hello all, welcome to episode 19 of Fire Code Tech. In this episode we have Lynne Kilpatrick. Lynne is a fire and life safety professional who has spent her career in code enforcement. Lynne's career specialty is in hazardous materials. In this interview, we get into some different pro tips for people who are in the business of dealing with hazardous materials. Lynne discusses her career and how she has been involved with addressing regulations from a wide variety of codes and standards, as well as Department of Transportation considerations. Lynne and I also talk about her most recent endeavor with her work with HMEx Assistant, a hazardous materials database that she has integrated into a web-based application. Lynne is very insightful and has a lot of great information for those who are involved in chemical and life safety. If you are a fan of the show, do me a huge favor and let somebody you know who is interested in fire and life safety about the podcast. Also, be sure to subscribe so you never miss an episode wherever you find your podcasts, and follow us on social media for all of the content that we release for fire protection and life safety. Well, hello, Lynne. Welcome to the show. I'm so happy to have you on. How are you doing today?
Hi, I'm good. It's great to be here. Thanks for having me.
Well, cool. So, usually, how I like to get started is let the listeners know a little bit of background on your career. I understand that you have a history in chemical engineering and being a fire marshal and some other works in and around that sort of engineering. I'd love to hear about that.
Okay. Well, I guess just broadly, yeah, in college, I took a, you know, organic chemistry class, found I liked it. I was pretty good at it. And obviously, like anyone else in college, wanted to make sure I was employable with whatever degree I got. So I decided to take on chemical engineering. And it was a really great decision in the end.
Yeah, I could see that. I have an affinity for chemistry, and yeah, so I understand that draw towards chemical engineering. Did you always have an affinity for um, the science and math and things like that, or
Not at all. that's
no?
that's what's so funny about it is that I don't think I really, felt like I had an affinity in that area when I was in high school. It wasn't until I kind of got to college and really explored with different classes and, took a few math classes, took a few chemistry classes and, all of a sudden I sort of realized I did have an affinity for that. So, yeah.
Huh. Very interesting. You picked one of the most difficult engineering disciplines out there, so that's a kind of unique one to stumble into.
I agree. I agree.
Huh. Very interesting. Awesome. So, you went to college for chemical engineering, and then, yeah. So, how did you find your way into fire protection and life safety? Did you have internships, or yeah, what was the path that kind of led
Okay.
you?
Yeah, I can explain that. So I didn't have any internships right out of college. I was hired by an environmental consulting firm in the Seattle area, and so I started there as a very junior employee in the business. And I was there about a year and a half, and I learned some amazing skills. They had a lot of government contracts, and there was a lot of writing of reports by multiple authors. So I got exposed to technical editors and learned some pretty amazing skills that I carried with me. But after about a year and a half, they started to have some financial difficulties and thought they might be laying off some folks. So I assumed I would be one of the first ones to go since I was one of the most recently hired. So I started looking around for new employment and found a advertisement in those days in the newspaper. The Seattle Fire Department was looking for a chemical engineer or chemist. I guess either one of those degrees would have satisfied their request. But anyway, I applied for a position with the Seattle Fire Department, never having seen a fire code. Not really understanding very well what a fire code was and what I would be doing for that department. Um, but it turns out I just, really got lucky. I feel like got very lucky landing that position. It was when the then Article 80 in the International or the Uniform Fire Code went from about 5 pages to 55 pages. So the Seattle Fire Department was contemplating how they were going to deal with that. And so they wanted to start a new program in their fire prevention division that focused on hazardous materials and would give them the resources to enforce those new provisions. So they were out looking for someone who could provide that technical expertise. And I got very lucky at that time. So that's how it all began.
Wow, that's fascinating. Yeah, I'm not aware of Article 80 and what that means as far as the fire code, but that's very fascinating. You speaking of your origin story and how you made your way into fire and life safety, I find that really interesting. Appreciate you sharing that.
Yeah.
Um, so you had your first job and you were speaking about these reports that kind of piqued my interest. So, what kind of regulations or things were you basing these reports on when you were writing these reports initially for this environmental engineering consulting firm that you were working for? Or,
So primarily, that consulting firm had a lot of government contracts, and they were working on some Superfund sites. And my role and responsibilities, there was a Superfund site in the Seattle area on Harbor Island, and we were essentially evaluating the previous facilities on that site that had either used or handled hazardous materials and evaluating whether or not they might have contributed to the contamination that was at the Superfund site. And so we would, basically be looking at their operations or their past operations. Most of them had, long been out of business. But we would look at what they were handling, and then we were ranking each one with respect to they were considered potentially responsible parties, and we would sort of rank them with respect to what the likelihood was that they had contributed. So those reports were just kind of ongoing, and yeah, so it was interesting work, that's for sure.
oh wow, I like hearing about that. That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't have any personal experience with Superfund sites or things of that nature, so yeah, it's a fascinating role. Sounds like you had. So I wanted to transition a little bit and talk about, yeah, your role at the Seattle Fire Department and what kind of your job looked like in being employed with the Seattle Fire Department and how you kind of got incorporated into your work with hazardous materials and what that looked like. Yeah, I'd love to hear about that.
Okay. So, like I said, the Seattle Fire Department at that time, most jurisdictions and many states in the West had adopted the Uniform Fire Code and the Uniform Building Code that sort of go hand in hand. And in the fire code, there was a chapter that dealt with hazardous materials. And at that time, the chapter had been significantly revised. And this was all around the time when in Silicon Valley there was a lot of high tech. There was a lot of semiconductor work starting. There was sort of some, new hazardous materials that were being handled and used prevalently in many jurisdictions. And there was a need to update those regulations in the fire code. So they expanded that chapter tremendously. And most fire departments, including Seattle, really didn't know, or even they were just weren't equipped to deal with those regulations, and how, if they were going to be responsible for enforcing them, how they were going to do that. So my role at the Seattle Fire Department initially was really to develop a program. Everything. I mean, from all of the resources that we might need, the staffing requirements, the training requirements, and I pulled together. It was really quite fun because I got to essentially develop a program from ground zero. And we presented it to City Council and said, if you are going to expect us to enforce these regulations here in the city, then we need resources to do that. And so we were successful, and we hired. I shouldn't say we hired. We drafted a couple of lieutenants and about 7 firefighters, because the Seattle Fire Department at that time, we were using sworn personnel to basically do those hazardous material inspections. So I started a program and was fortunate enough to be able to, basically be the supervisor of that group of individuals, and it was everything from, code enforcement to permitting, designing a permit program, temporary and annual permits, training the inspectors, deciding how our enforcement program would go, as well as in some jurisdictions and in Seattle, they amend the state adopted code and add local amendments. So at that time, we had a fire code advisory board. It was about a 15-member board that represented the community, different business segments, as well as the public, and any local amendments that we wanted to adopt and draft and incorporate into the state code. We had to first get clearance from the Fire Code Advisory Board. So I would liaison with the Fire Code Advisory Board, and then we would bring those local amendments to the City Council for adoption. So there was a lot of code development work associated with that as well. And then obviously, we would liaison with the operations side of the house if there were hazardous material incidents and they needed some technical support. There was also the, whole, um, I want to say, plan review and pre-designed conferences with developers and architects and folks who wanted to, build new buildings where hazardous materials were going to be involved. So the role was very, very broad. Lots of activity and, lots of different things to do just related to hazardous materials.
That's remarkable. Yeah, it sounds like you really got to experience the full gamut of hazardous materials and interacting with those in the built environment, and also um, in more of a hazardous materials incident capacity. And so, yeah, that's extremely fascinating to hear about. You speak about your career and your role and being a part of a program and building a program from the bottom up. So, wow, that's fascinating. I love hearing about that. Yeah, maybe just for the layperson or somebody who's not extremely aware of hazardous materials and what all that encompasses, maybe you could go over kind of what qualifies something as a hazardous material, or what does that look like in the context of your role that you had with the Seattle Fire Department.
Yeah, sure. So hazardous materials can be, that term is used, can be just extremely broad. In the context of the fire and building code and the enforcement of, those rules and regulations, Um, Essentially, you can break them down into sort of two broad categories. Those hazardous materials that have that present a physical hazard, like they are flammable, or they are water reactive, or they are explosive, or they have oxidizing capabilities, things that can, a hazard that would present a physical hazard. And then there are health hazards, materials that qualify as health hazards, and that can be very broad. The fire code currently focuses on the more acute health hazards, like something that is toxic or highly toxic and corrosive. The code used to actually go into regulating some of the more chronic hazards, like carcinogens and irritants and sensitizers and radioactives. It no longer covers those types of materials. It has narrowed its focus on the more acute health hazards. So right now, the fire and building code really do, sort of narrow the field in terms of hazardous materials with respect to things that can either present a physical or health hazard, an immediate physical or health hazard.
That's great. I love that explanation. Yeah. It's I always like hearing from the experts about the description of these things because, even though there are definitions in the building code, sometimes I can find that it's a little bit hard to get the idea of how to define these chemicals. There can be, sometimes it's difficult, of course, when with the flammable and combustible liquid, there's clear and defined thresholds for these chemicals, but with something like a oxidizer or a corrosive or a caustic material, sometimes it can be a little bit more difficult to suss out if you have a problem. I guess it just comes from some of the testing methods and how these get tested and verified for how these chemicals are hazardous or not. And yeah, I don't know. It's just a
Right.
comment on the difficulty of dealing with these materials.
It is. It is a challenge. That's no doubt.
So, yeah, I know that we've talked about the building code a little bit, but also I just wanted to ask about if you had experience during your role dealing with hazardous materials transportation or any of those other uh, like OSHA related federal standards, or was it mostly just the built environment that you were concerned with?
A little of all of that. So the Department of Transportation obviously, regulates interstate commerce. But there's also transportation, within a facility, and I had a lot of experience with that in Seattle. It being um, a having a marine terminals and a port city. So we dealt with hazardous materials coming across the marine terminals very frequently, and we had a lieutenant who was dedicated just to dealing with the hazardous materials at the marine terminals. And so we would regulate, where the materials could be stored on the terminal itself. So the Department of Transportation certainly was involved in those activities, as well as, some of the regulations in the fire code relate to tank vehicles and transportation and loading and unloading of tank vehicles. So some of that would come into play as well when you were regulating, um, a bulk petroleum facility, for instance, that had loading and unloading facilities, and some of those tank vehicle regulations. So the transportation, even though it's regulated by DOT, you still did as a part of our we still did as a part of our role, have to be very cognizant of those regulations and how they sort of played into the fire and building code regulations as well. Um, so yeah, and obviously, any of these other federal regulations, the OSHA regulations, most of these facilities had to comply with all of these other federal regulations. And in my role in Sunnyvale, the state of California has a very unique program where local jurisdictions can essentially agree to enforce some of those environmental rules as a part of their program. So we were, partly responsible for enforcing some of the sort of local waste regulations, some of the local clean air type regulations for accidental releases from these facilities. Um, so yes, so you do have to, incorporate and at least have some familiarity and be aware of all of these other federal regulations that are impacting the facilities, and might sort of overlap with the fire and building code rules.
That's fascinating. Yeah, I don't get into as much of the transportation side of things, although, as a part of the program that I graduated from, we did speak to hazardous materials and their um, treatment and response in a transportation capacity. Of course, the hazard diamonds and different ways that they are classified in the transportation means and how those are different from the way that they're classified in the built environment as far as nomenclature or just hazardous design. Uh,
Right.
yeah, but anyways, for my personal interest, since I deal with the built environment, and I am really interested to hear you talk about how you have experience in like sort of meetings with architects and engineers, and I find it to be a exceedingly difficult task to compile these hazardous materials and the requirements for them. So, yeah, I just wanted to ask you about, what one of these meetings with the architect or engineer would look like if you were going to, if they had questions about their hazardous materials compliance, or, what form does compliance look like for architects and engineers for the built environment, let's say for a new construction building, if somebody
Yeah.
wants to be straightforward and code compliant.
Yeah. So often, outside of the general pre-designed conferences, you would meet with the a group of architects and designers, and hopefully, facility representatives. So the people who are actually going to be the end users and know exactly how the materials are going to be used and in what quantities. So the starting point for any of this is really knowing what you have, how much of it you're going to have, and where it's going to be and how it's going to be stored or used. And once you can capture that information, then you can really start to navigate through the fire and building code and identify what the fire protection controls are going to be needed. um, so the meetings often, we just have conversations about exactly what's going to take place, how they're going to use the materials, how the materials are received, where they're stored, how they're handled, what type of equipment and systems they're planning. And most of the time, the facilities that are really serious about this have hired consulting firms who have some familiarity with the requirements, so you're often not having to explain everything from the ground up. But one of the starting points for sure is really capturing everything that's going to be used, and being and understanding all of its hazards, all of the hazards, because many of the materials will present multiple hazards. um, so that's kind of the starting point. And what's fascinating about some of it is, obviously, the code is limited with respect to what it contains. Obviously, it speaks and directs you very broadly with respect to how to manage hazardous materials by category. But there's oftentimes no roadmap in the fire code for what it is the facility wants to do. And so that's when it gets really interesting. That's when it gets really fun, to, sort of identify, outside of the context of the code, what needs to be in place and what kind of controls are necessary and reasonable with respect to, what they plan to be doing. And a good example of that right now is, lithium batteries. There's nothing in the fire and building code right now that gives us guidance with respect to what to do with lithium batteries. Um, so every jurisdiction is really, faced with how they're going to handle it. Coming up with some guidelines on, the storage and, I guess the use as well. These energy storage systems. There is stuff in the 2018 code that's coming out with respect to energy storage systems. But when you've got, lithium batteries in storage, either, newly manufactured or if you can think of the end of life batteries after these devices, after we've finished using the devices and the batteries have to be recycled, there's a whole activity going on about removing the batteries and storing the spent batteries, and trying to get rid of those. So it's very fascinating, and like I said, not every activity that the facilities want to do is really captured in the code currently.
Yeah, that's a great point. I love that point about, there are portions of the code which are gray to the point of ambiguity as far as specific combinations or uh, types of hazardous materials. And it's been really interesting to see energy storage systems and the new research that's been put out about energy storage systems and the hazards that they pose. Yeah, I think I saw you link an article recently about energy storage systems. It looked pretty comprehensive, but yeah, I have a personal fascination about them as well. I think I was reading something about FM had a new paper recently about energy storage systems and some of the fire protection and life safety measures for these different batteries or batteries isn't the word, but assemblies of batteries and how they store energy storage systems is the correct term. But yeah, I find that extremely fascinating. And anyways, yeah, I wanted to ask, what do you see as the future of these? Sort of a tangent, but it sounds like you've been reading about energy storage systems. So I'd love to hear about what you see as the future for these things. And as the building code gets these more fleshed out, what do you see as the likely conclusion or the next steps for defining the hazards for these energy storage systems, and how do we move forward?
Well, like I said, the 2018 edition of the code has a new chapter dealing with these energy storage systems, and like you mentioned, there's still ongoing research with respect to how to properly, protect these systems. And we're learning stuff new every day. Obviously, there was a fairly recent incident in 2019 outside of Phoenix that resulted in an explosion. And and this may be the article that you're referring to. There's some lessons learned from that incident that injured some firefighters. These technologies, the new emerging technologies, obviously present some issues that we don't always have a firm grasp on initially. But with respect to the energy storage systems, like I said, there's some good guidance that's going to be in the 2018 edition of the code, if it's not already been adopted in your local jurisdictions. And then there's ongoing activity behind the scenes with the fire code action committees, who are dealing with this very topic, and getting together and having work group meetings regularly to try to develop the what will be the new code proposals to modify chapter 12 and update it and improve it. So there's constant activity going on, and trying to stay abreast of all of it is often challenging for most of us because we've got other things we're doing at the same time. But yeah, there is just a tremendous amount of work in this area going on behind the scenes.
Definitely, definitely. I understand what you're saying. It's neat to keep up with these new and emerging technologies, but yeah, it's hard to. You can't really stay focused on them because they're changing so quickly. Um, yeah, you said something earlier, and I really thought it was a great quote. You said I was asking you about how do you define these meetings or these hazardous materials, and you said knowing what you have, knowing how much of it you have, and knowing how it's going to be stored and used. And I thought that that was a wonderful little capturing of how to deal with hazardous materials as it regards to the building code. But yeah, I just wanted to um, get back to our talk about hazardous materials and just speak a little bit more about um, yeah, I don't know. I just been dealing with hazardous materials a lot recently, and I just want to get some. If you have tips, or I know that the obvious one is to try to capture these qualifications or requirements as early as possible. But I see, we talked about consultants or professionals who have experience with this, so you're not having to start from ground zero. But yeah, I didn't know if you had any tips for how to capture these requirements or how to properly deal with these hazards. And I don't know, yeah, maybe that's too nebulous, but
Well, I do think that if you put some framework around it, and this is what I've always had to do, at least from my vantage point, for a code official to be able to evaluate what's being proposed. I can't tell you how many times I've had to turn away plans at the counter or turn away um, you know consultants who are there to get over the counter permits, because there just wasn't sufficient information being provided with respect to the materials that were going to be used, and their hazards. So it really is the obligation of the user to be providing the proper information to the jurisdiction so that they can give the guidance that's needed. But that is the starting point, and like I said, I've had to turn many folks away just because there's just not enough information to do the evaluation. The sooner that becomes something that they do at the onset of a project, the more likely it is that that will go smoothly. um, yeah, so that's one of my biggest tips is really just understanding. And I did say that before, just understanding what exactly it is that's going to be used, and how it's going to be used.
yeah, that's a good tip. Yeah, it can sometimes be difficult to extract that knowledge of the quantities and the specific chemicals and material data sheets, but I find that the larger a client, as far as employees or the size of the company, the more likely it is that they'll have somebody whose position is dedicated to this sort of role of knowing what their hazardous materials registry looks like and getting this list of quantities and compatibilities or incompatibilities for their register of materials. So yeah, I think that's a good point. That's always usually the biggest struggle is trying to find out what it is that we're storing. I understand from our conversation before that um, if you're comfortable with talking about it, that you're working on putting together a tool, a hazardous materials data tool or database, and that you had used in your career uh, several times or throughout your career. I'd love to hear more about that. I was really interested when you were telling me about the database and its use and kind of how you're refurbishing it. If you'd tell me about that,
Yeah.
Appreciate it.
Yeah, sure. So we were just talking about how it is such a struggle to really identify how to classify the materials based on the fire and building code definitions, which do differ from transportation definitions, and it does also differ from any of the OSHA or GHS, regulations that we've got with classifying materials. And so for many years, and that's been true for a very long time. And so most all of my career, I used a essentially it was a CD that was available through ICC, the International Code Council, and it was HMEx Assistant was the name of the software. And it was like I said, it was a CD. You loaded it on your computer, and one time, and you were off to the races. But it did classify. You could look up in the database, the classification of the materials. You could easily identify whether it was a class 2 oxidizer, a corrosive, a toxic, a highly toxic, water reactive, 3. Like you said, some of the definitions are very prescriptive and they're easy to, use the safety data sheets to sort of find out what the classification is. But some of the definitions are very, they're not prescriptive, they're very subjective, and trying to figure out, exactly where the material fits into those hazard classes is a challenge. So this piece of software that I used for 25 years was, you know, something I relied on every day, pretty much. And when I found out that the founder was no longer going to be updating the information, I sort of saw an opportunity I didn't want it to essentially just fade away to nothing. So I purchased the software, and I have been, since the end of last year, working to make it a cloud based system, and expanding it so that the users not only can look up hazardous materials in the database to find the classifications, but you can actually manage your inventory in there as well. Inventories, as you know, to determine whether or not they're over the maximum allowable quantity that's allowed by the code. You have to know your inventory by control area. So this software enables the user to essentially evaluate their inventory and compare with the maximum allowable quantities and see if they're over for control areas, which, as you know, then sort of guides whether or not the occupancy needs to be a hazardous group H occupancy or not.
Yeah, that's great. I love hearing about that. I'm such a big fan of uh, technology, and even better is where the code nerd in me meets technology, and we can see the advancement of the field through kind of pairing these two things together. So I'm endlessly fascinated with that, and it sounds like a tool that I would love to use. So yeah, I'm really fascinated with that. That's pretty
Yeah,
interesting.
it should be useful to code officials, as I used it for many years, just to verify and validate what the architects, designers, and facilities were submitting. Just verifying and validating that they had properly classified things. But yeah, it can be used by architects and consultants and facilities as well.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Yeah, I talked to another chemical engineer recently, and we were talking about the caveats of H occupancies and when you need them and when you don't, and sort of what the different variances are for the different levels of H occupancy. But yeah, they can be a pretty costly endeavor if you happen to exceed maximum allowable quantities for your control areas and find yourself in a situation in which you need to provide a H occupancy or a detached structure for your H occupancy. So it
Right.
sounds like a good thing to know. But yeah, I think that's very interesting. I'd love to keep in touch about that and know as it progresses. And maybe when it comes out, we can let everybody know, and I'm sure people will be interested in taking a look at it. But yeah, that's fascinating.
Yeah, great.
Um, so I wanted to get into some couple different professional development topics, but I know we just recently talked about energy storage systems, but I wanted to pick your brain on what other trends in the industry you see right now for fire protection and life safety.
Well, the trends, um, in terms of, I don't know that there's any. Are you talking about emerging technologies or uh, trend?
Sorry, it could be nebulous. Really, I just mean like things that you see in the industry as new topics that are gaining popularity. Like when I think of this, I think of how I see a lot for timber, how buildings are taller and taller buildings are being built with timber or energy storage systems or just some of the new hazards we're seeing as an industry in fire protection and life safety. Or I have a special interest in technology or the system side of things. So yeah,
Yeah.
so that sort of thing. But yeah,
Well, clearly the batteries and the energy storage systems is probably the biggest one for sure. Another one that's been an issue for folks dealing with hazardous materials lately has been mobile fueling, essentially. This has been a challenging and debated topic, and there are some relatively new regulations related to um, mobile fueling using class one liquids, so gasoline. We've had for many years in the code, regulations that deal with fueling of class two and three liquids, diesels, and but the mobile fueling using class one liquids is relatively new and, like I said, fairly controversial. I dealt with the topic as the fire marshal in Sunnyvale. Um, and so the industry is obviously wanting to expand from maybe what the current regulations allow, which is allowing that in large sort of parking lots as opposed to street fueling. So that's probably a topic of interest to most folks that are sort of involved in hazardous materials. Um, but clearly, the battery issue is first and foremost, taking center stage.
definitely, I agree with that. So when you say mobile fueling, I guess I just don't have a real good picture in my mind of what that is. Is this like a truck or something that's providing gasoline to other vehicles, or what is it?
Yeah, yeah. It is. It is essentially, fueling from a truck to your personal vehicle, basically. And there's different models of this. There's, a model that might include what looks like a mini tank vehicle, right? Very small and maneuverable through parking lots and built to tank vehicle standards. But there's also the model which includes, they're not even portable tanks, but they're just containers in the back of a pickup truck that will move around the city and essentially and they're it's very technology driven, right? You download the app on your phone, you order up the gas, and while you're working during the day, they come by the parking lot where you may have your car parked and fill your fuel tank. So that issue and that topic was first addressed in, I believe, the 2000 and oh, may have been in the 2015 edition of the code. But it's obviously a topic where the industry wants to expand its footprint with respect to that activity. So there's task groups and ongoing work in terms of what are the safety precautions that need to be taken, and how can we best allow for sort of that, I guess, emerging. It's not really an emerging technology, but it's sort of an emerging activity.
Interesting. Yeah, I've never heard of that. It sounds like it could be pretty hazardous, though. Yeah, just read a good article recently about hazard, the hazardous nature of uh, intermediate bulk containers or composite IBCs.
Right.
How they can. It sounds like one of these vessels that somebody could have in the back of their car or the back of their truck, I should say. And so you could easily get several hundred gallons of class one flammable liquids, and that sounds like a unique.
Yeah, they're actually not using the IBCs, but they're using container sizes somewhere below about 109 gallons, which is just below the threshold that they actually end up being regulated. So,
Mm,
and they'll put maybe three or possibly four in the back of a pickup, and yeah. So it's like I said, the code is starting to address that, and some jurisdictions may not have actually seen it yet, but like I said, it is certainly an area of the code that's expanding with respect to that activity.
interesting. Well, I appreciate you bringing it up. I hadn't heard of that. Um, so another topic I always like to ask professionals is, uh, what resources would you recommend to somebody who wants to learn more about hazardous materials or maybe just fire protection and life safety in general?
Well, my biggest resource has always been, getting and staying involved with, whatever local organizations you can. If there are local, fire communities, if you're a code official, trying to stay connected with, the training and outreach to your other jurisdictions, your counterparts in other jurisdictions. I have found that to be the most, you know, the most amazing resource throughout my career, is making the connections with other people. I can't tell you how many times I've just connected with what I consider to be experts that I respect, and just continued to ask questions. You don't be shy, don't be bashful, but so for me, staying involved with the organizations that are sort of dealing with the topics, is just the best resource of all, and it can be lifelong, essentially.
Yeah, that's wonderful. I resonate with that a lot. It feels like to me that fire protection is a very close knit, fire protection life safety is a very close knit field, and that people are always very willing to share their knowledge and their expertise. If you have a question or topic that you don't know about, yeah, it seems like also with the authorities having jurisdiction is even a tighter knit group of individuals, and that between jurisdictions, there's a lot of cross pollination as far as policy and procedure in regards to life safety. So, yeah, I think that's a great tip. For people to stay connected through groups and organizations.
Yeah, I think there's obviously a lot that you can learn from books and periodicals and whatnot, but talking with someone about their experiences, and what they learned, and what they went through, and what went right, what went wrong. It's invaluable, and it's really hard to get that same kind of information from books or online sources. So, I am quick to pick up a phone and chat with folks who I feel can share information with me. And I just encourage others to do the same. It's been an invaluable tool.
Yeah, it's remarkable how much time you can spend Googling something or searching through code books or standard books. And, if you're able to just spend 2 minutes with somebody who's a expert in the field or has conquered that problem before, it can just save you hours of time. So I think that's a great point. Anyways, well, I wanted to end, Lynn, with I wanted to ask you, what do you wish you would have known when you got started at the beginning of your career? Or uh, what's one piece of advice that you would give somebody getting into fire protection and life safety right now?
Well, it's almost the same thing, ask people questions and get to know people. If I had to look back, obviously I wished I would have known more about the career in general. From the beginning. I happened to just sort of stumble across the topic. And it certainly was my experience as the fire marshal that one of our biggest challenges was just finding folks to hire. It's just not a field that is, um, you know, uh, well known or well advertised, unfortunately. And I would say it's, as a new person starting out, you know, for me, 30 years down the road, uh, honestly, it was so fascinating, and there was barely a day that I didn't learn something new. There are so many topics and so many areas where you can focus and learn, that it is just an endless learning experience.
Yeah, I agree with you, Lynn. I think that fire protection and life safety doesn't get the PR it deserves. I think that if people only knew about what a fascinating career and what kind of rich and fulfilling work that we get to do on a daily basis, I think that people would be flocking to join the endeavor. But yeah, I totally agree with you. Well, anyways, I just want to thank you again so much, Lynn, for coming on and talking with me. I really appreciate it, and yeah, I got to learn a lot by
Great.
talking to you.
Thank
So,
you. Yeah,
so
it's been
thanks.
fun. Thank you. Thank you.
Thanks for listening, everybody. Be sure to share the episode with a friend if you enjoyed it. Don't forget that fire protection and life safety is serious business. The views and opinions expressed on this podcast are by no means a professional consultation or a codes and standards interpretation. Be sure to contact a licensed professional if you are getting involved with fire protection and or life safety. Thanks again, and we'll see you next time.